Dave. Thank you very much. It's hard to wrangle these many people from all parts of the country and stuff. So it's good. And when we were planning out our schedule, Dave asked me to do something on, what my people Navidad, right? Something about growing up where I did and the holiday tradition. So this is a little bit on it. First off, we started going into a tangent about one of the uh, one of these sacred items in a Mexican Christmas, which is the tamale. This is I saw a neat little graphic about stuff that's in the beef Wellington family, something encasing something else, and they had a beef Wellington, a corn dog, hot pocket, that kind of stuff. And along with that was the tamale and other stuff. When I was growing up, this was something that a lot of families did, and we did it, as an assembly line type of thing. And we would all get together, and each people would do stuff, and it was efficient. A few of my family worked in the Ford auto factory. A few in my family worked at a Ford auto factory that was in town. So we had a background in doing that kind of stuff in the assembly line work. Um, and now, because of how busy people are, it's become more of something where somebody across the way or on the other street that makes them. And that's what I did this weekend. My dad suddenly became a tamale connoisseur and didn't want to get them from where we usually go. And so I had to go to a couple places, and I brought them some to try out. So we'll see what the verdict is, and if I did well, if I learned from my uh, from my upbringing that they're gonna like this. That's part of it. But I also wanted to talk about where I grew up. It's a little suburb in LA called Pico Rivera. And Pico is very much East Los Angeles, um, which is its own little conclave for those of you who are joining us from outside of the area. The running joke was if you made enough money when you lived in East LA, you kept on moving east. So the better you did, the closer you lived to the IKEA that's off the 60 freeway. Uh, so my folks moved from East LA to Pico in the late 50s. So I grew up LA adjacent in that little community right there. And my two older brothers and little sister grew up there as well. And it was a great time to be a kid. There was a constant fun to be had outdoors without that distraction of electronic devices. And we were listening to music and seeing movies and TV shows that fueled our imaginations. And we were watching on these gigantic Admiral TV console stereo systems that would basically qualify as SUVs now. I mean, these things were huge. Um, One TV show in particular that I remember looking forward to seeing aired in 67. And it featured kids from a comic strip that I felt a lot of affinity towards. And it was a Charlie Brown Christmas. And I think I loved the strip because I felt close to Charlie Brown at the time. I was an asthmatic kid that had trouble relating to people. So I felt almost as put upon as Charlie did. And what I saw during the program and what really resonated with me was disparate, different kids with different emotional makeups that while they didn't always get along, they still loved and cared about each other. And that was very clear from the programming. And just as important to me as the program was the beautiful music that was being played. And I love this music because I knew that before I knew it was jazz or the Vince Guaraldi trio or anything other than it really touched my soul. And this is still one of my favorite albums ever, not just a holiday record or Christmas record. And I'm sure the love I felt for the music propelled me into the career that I've had in the music industry, as well as the lifetime passion for music that I've had. One of the scenes that meant a lot to me on this Charlie Brown Christmas program was when Charlie Brown picked up a scrawny little tree to be the centerpiece of the holiday play they were putting on. And the kids made fun of the tree and Charlie, and when he put an ornament on it, the little tree bent over and he thought he killed it. And Linus said, I never thought it was such a bad little tree. It's not bad at all, really. Maybe it just needs a little love. And he wrapped his security blanket under the base to give it some support and put some ornaments on it to make it as beautiful as any tree. And maybe that's one of those points in people's lives where they consciously or subconsciously become awakened to the compassionate and empathetic inner voice. And I think that for me, the struggle to be an open human being begins with seeing people in the eyes of that little character with that little security blanket and saying to yourself, I never thought it was such a bad little tree. It's not bad at all, really. And maybe it just needs some love. So thank you very much, folks, for listening.
Thank you, Rick. Wow. I really appreciate that. You really came through. So now I have to buy that album. I'm the music meister at holiday time in our family, and that is essential.
We're thrilled to have Steve Chase with us. Several of us read a story of his most recent activities, and it only tapped into a long life of commitment to peace and justice. We've asked him to elaborate on his own journey that has brought him to this work. So, Steve, we're very eager to hear you. Make your full presentation, and then the group is always eager to engage in questions and answers.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, and everyone for this opportunity to speak. I normally, when I'm talking about Israel and Palestine, am reflecting on my June trip with a Quaker delegation to Israel, Palestine, and then drawing lessons for the current situation. And it has lots of photographs of Israel and Palestine, particularly the West Bank, and people we met and things we experienced. That's usually about an hour long with a half hour to an hour of conversation afterwards. I don't have the time to do that. And I think that maybe more important is to talk about the power and position of interfaith coalitions for justice and peace throughout the US to address the situation of not just simplistically choosing sides. Oh, I support all the policies of the state of Israel, and I support the Biden administration supporting the policies of Israel, or I support Hamas, or this. But to stand from a faith position with empathy for all suffering civilians and individuals. And like a village priest that I met in Palestine, he said something that I just think we should, that as an interfaith coalition, for peace and justice, we could probably all agree with. And he said to us at the Quaker delegation Doesn't matter if your name is Moshe, Mohammed, or Matthew, all are precious in the sight of God, and all deserve to live lives of peace, security, justice, and equality. And I think that needs to be our center as we try to respond to this horrific moment from October 7th on, where we saw tremendous agony and atrocities committed against Israeli civilians, as well as some military personnel, and captives taken back into Gaza. And almost immediately, a massive, and in my mind, uncreative, immoral, and unstrategic response of mass murder and collective punishment of 2.3 million people in Gaza. And while that's happening and the world's attention and agony is focused on Gaza, the settler movement and the IDF in the West Bank is upped the scale of violence. 4,000 more Palestinians in the West Bank have been imprisoned since October 7th, bringing the total to about 8,000. And the settler violence on the West Bank is really intense. And I think from a standpoint of a faith tradition, we can look critically at the policies of Hamas and recognize that they're just one group which has minority support in the Palestinian community. The state of Israel, which has diverse opinions in that population, and in the United States. We can look critically at things. But I think, well, Steve had asked me to talk a little about how did I even become focused on Israel, Palestine, and US foreign policy towards it. And it goes way back. I became a Quaker when I was 13. I was a Boy Scout at a jamboree in the town square of Galesburg, Illinois. I was in my uniform. I had finished up my things, and it was 1968. I was 13. And I, for the first time, saw a silent peace vigil against the US war of aggression against the Vietnamese people. I'd never seen that in my little town, adults standing up for peace. And I wanted to go over, but I was scared to take my first public action. And then I just thought about my hero, Martin Luther King, who just less than a year before that came out against the war and said, it's time to break silence. And so I screwed up my courage. I joined the vigil line, and within about a minute, my scoutmaster saw me, ran over, grabbed me, pulled me out of the vigil line that I was standing in, and he was shaking me and yelling at me, calling me a communist, a terrorist, a traitor. And he kicked me out of his troop, and he said that I would not be allowed to be a member of any Boy Scout troop in my county. He pushed me away and stormed off. I was stunned. And the vigil ended, and an older woman from the vigil came and put her hand on my arm, and she said, young man, I am so sorry that just happened to you. You would always be welcome at a Quaker meeting. And so I went home, talked to my mom. She told me a little what she knew about Quakers, urged me to call. And so the Boy Scout Jamboree was on a Saturday, and I went to my first meeting for worship the next day on Sunday. And I had been to synagogues, I'd been to various churches, but I felt really at home among friends. And things that attracted me when I was 13 and still attract me today are the integration of a liberation theology that is working for the kingdom of God, or as Martin Luther King would talk about, the beloved community of justice and peace and equality. contemplative spirituality, where we quiet ourselves, that we're not just always in stimulus and response, but we create a space in between that to really discern what is God's will and what is a path forward. And a long history of faith-based activism for peace and justice. So that's sort of my general framework. Even before that, I remember I was 6 or 7 years old and I heard the word Holocaust. And I didn't know what it meant, but I could tell from the context of hearing somebody talk about it, it was a really horrible thing. And I went and I asked my mom, I said, what is the Holocaust? And when I think back now, you have a child, 6 or 7 years old, who asks you that question. What are your choices? You could tell the truth and crush their spirit forever about the enormity of human capacity for evil and injustice, or you could lie to try to spare the kid. And she threaded the needle and she told me the truth. And I learned about Hitler. I learned about anti-Semitism. I learned about 11 million people being killed in the camp, 6 million of them Jews. But she also told me the story about the Danish resistance to Nazi occupation and various ways that the Danes acted in solidarity. The Danish Gentiles acted in solidarity with their Jewish neighbors, defended them, pushed back against the Nazis. And so I got a sense from that human beings are incredibly capable of self-justifying incredible violence and harm against others. But we also have the capacity to be faithful, brave, to act in solidarity with each other. And my mom was never one to just let the moral of a story emerge in me. And she said to me directly after telling me this is, if I am ever in a targeted group like the Jews in Germany and much of Europe, I need to reach out for allies and find a way to fight for rights and justice and equality. And if I ever witness another group that's targeted like that and I'm not in that group, I have the moral responsibility to work in alliance with that targeted group for justice. Now, I originally, partially because of this, and partially of the milieu that I was growing up in the movie Exodus, I was very an ardent Zionist, even though I was a Gentile teenager from Illinois, central Illinois, in a little town, because it seemed like Zionism provided a pathway after the Holocaust for protecting Jewish people, and after a horrendous thing, just horrendous atrocity. But I wasn't thinking at that point about Palestinians and what is the impact of that project on Palestinians. And so it has been a slow process over decades to try to get the bigger picture and to look at these two historically oppressed groups, one oppressed largely in Europe, and one oppressed by the new immigrants who had a Zionist project, who weren't coming to historic Palestine to be neighbors, but to be sort of masters of the realm, to control things, to create a majority. And it was a settler colonial project, even though it was motivated by very real concerns about anti-Semitism and Jewish liberation, but it was conflated even in the early days. So that's some of my background. And I wrote a pamphlet about my evolution from being an ardent Zionist to trying to look more deeply at what does justice and peace demand in the Holy Land, and as a U.S. citizen, given that the U.S. is the biggest foreign third party in all of this that has enormous influence, what is my responsibility and what is ours to do? So that's, so I started paying more and more attention, listening more to Jewish dissidents and Israeli dissidents, and then ultimately listening to Palestinian Americans and Palestinians in historic Palestine and in Israel, and trying to develop a bigger picture of what would peace with justice mean. Now, since October 7th, it is really hard to live in denial anymore. It's hard to be distracted, but it's very easy to live in despair. And I think we have to expand our empathy, and that our spiritual traditions helps us with that. But in my congregation at Friends Meeting of Washington, there's a recently married couple. The husband is an Israeli-American liberal Zionist. He hates the occupation. He thinks that the US-backed Israeli state policy has created a system of apartheid. He wants it to end, but he also thinks it's really important to have a Jewish state that can protect itself. He is married to a Palestinian American woman who is a graduate of the Ramallah Friends School, a Quaker school in Palestine that was started in 1869, long before Israel even existed. And they have been so open with our meetings since October 7th, where the husband, it is so easy for him to empathize with the suffering of Israeli civilians from October 7th, with the military wing of Hamas attacking. And he struggles to feel empathy for what's happening to the 2.3 million people in Gaza. And his wife has an easy time immediately identifying with her historical community and seeing the horrendous things that are happening there. And she knows that it's bad for what happened to Israeli civilians, but it's sort of emotional labor to expand her heart that big. And they've been working, and we've been helping, and they have gotten there. They have expanded their hearts. They are still happily in love. And to me, that's a metaphor of the work we need to do here in the United States with the people around us. In my meeting, because the Friends Committee of National Legislation, the American Friends Service Committee, and Quaker organizations all over the world pretty quickly after October 7th, and then the huge collective punishment and mass murder campaign that the US was backing Israel to do in Gaza, did a joint statement. And it was essentially talking about we need to de-escalate the current conflict, and we need to move forward to peace with justice. And so they put out four points to think about, a program. One is ceasefire now. One is release the captives, which includes the many people in administrative detention, including children, Palestinian children who are not charged with crimes, but are our captives as well, and to restore humanitarian aid. Because it's just horrendous when you're depriving a population of 2.3 million people of food, of clean water, of medicine, of fuel and electricity. You displace 85% of the population. You destroy more than 50% of the housing. You're hitting infrastructures. It is a horror what's happening. But in my meeting, we had this from like larger international Quaker organizations, and then we tried to just do a statement of where we stand, and do we support those three immediate things for de-escalation, and do we support the fourth thing of supporting all nonviolent efforts to generate, end the occupation, end the system of apartheid, and create greater equality and justice for all between the river and sea, including Israeli Jews, Palestinian Israelis, and then the Palestinians in the occupied territories. And it turns out that was quite controversial, just in our little Quaker meeting. We housed the DC Minyan, a Jewish congregation, and we wanted to think well about them, and with talking about ceasefire now, work with them. And so there was intense debate and dialogue and listening and pain and friction for a while, just in our Quaker meeting, which might be surprising. And I think of Paul writing to the Romans, who were friends and followers of Jesus in the belly of the beast of the largest empire ever known, and was the occupying power of Palestine in the first century. And do not be conformed to this world, meaning the imperial world of domination, but be transformed by renewing of your mind so you may discern the will of God. And we had enough curiosity, and we worked on that, and we finally agreed on a statement talking about the three immediate goals for de-escalation, and then a longer-term goal of peace with justice. But it was hard won, just in one congregation. So that's true when you think about interfaith work. Now, in order to speed this along, we standing up for peace with justice is not easy in a time of trauma and polarization and organized interests that are trying to support war or violence, and that people are just so raw. And I learned this firsthand, because after I came back from Israel and Palestine in June, I felt an enormous responsibility because what I saw and what I talk about in my talk, Why Peace with Justice, Reflections on a Quaker Delegation to Israel, Palestine, we went there partially to see, is it true what Amnesty International is saying, and Human Rights Watch is saying, and the human rights group B'Tselem in Israel is saying, is that the US-backed Israeli government has created a system of apartheid on top of military occupation. And it was the most gut-wrenching 3 weeks of my life. I saw tremendous suffering and injustice. I also met people who were looking beyond the current pain and we're trying to work for and envision a better future for all between the river and the sea. And I came back feeling responsibility to tell the story of what I saw, that it was apartheid. We do have so much work to do, and we have to change US foreign policy. So I gave a talk to my meeting, and I also gave a talk to the DC Metro chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace, which I had worked with as an interfaith ally for about 5 years. And the JVP one was done on Zoom. And there was a person from JVP Northern New Jersey who saw that. And so this probably would have been in July. And so by August, they had invited me to come to Montclair, New Jersey, to speak at a UU church. They had rented a hall from a UU church in Montclair. There were a number of co-sponsors to the event, but the main organizer was Northern New Jersey Jewish Voice for Peace. And so we set it up for, by the end of the summer, we had already picked the date of October 22nd. So we were all set, and then October 7th happens, and the conversation, my experience is useful because there is a history to this problem and we have to understand it, but we also have to put it in this new frame of, the current moment. And so we made adjustments to the program, and I redid sort of my slideshow to address the current moment, not just sort of the history and what I saw. And 2 days, and this is what Steve was talking about reading the story. 2 days before that, the co-pastors of the UU church just called up the JVP main organizers and said, we're going to unilaterally cancel the event. You can't have it here. And then they further said, we've been getting pressure from other people who are telling us terrible things about JVP, and we don't think we have any overlap in terms of values with you, and we will not rent to you again, and that's final. So that was too bad. It turns out they got advice from people in their community who were very supportive of what the US-backed Israel policy in Gaza was. And that they heard from somebody who was a staffer from the Anti-Defamation League, which frankly has said many false and terrible things about JVP and demonized it. And so that's the information they had. And so they cut that off. The group that organized, which include Pax Christi, an FCNL, Friends Committee of National Legislation Advocacy team, Veterans for Peace, some other groups, then went to the public library, and we rescheduled my talk, Why Peace with Justice, Reflections on the Trip, at the public library in Montclair. And that was scheduled for November 12th. And this is just one story, one small story among many across the country where people who are speaking up for peace with justice are being suppressed. And anybody who's speaking up for Palestinian rights in general is being suppressed in the United States at a kind of McCarthyite level. And it's intense. But so the head of Montclair, New Jersey Civil Rights Commission asked the library board to stop me giving a talk about peace with justice, and said some terrible false things about JVP, and described it would be like giving Hitler a microphone at the public library. And not a lot of Quakers are usually compared to Hitler. and so the library scheduled an emergency meeting and that was on a Friday, that there was a petition with 400 people from the community saying block the talk at the library. There was a big piece in the paper. That Saturday, the next day, there was an emergency meeting, and it was 2 hours of public comment. And there were many people who spoke up for the right to free speech. There were many people who said we really need to have dialogues with each other, and this perspective of a Quaker peace activist might be useful, and there will be a Q&A time afterwards so people can disagree and people spoke up for that. Several people spoke up for, explaining what Jewish Voice for Peace really is about, and countering some of the really terrible things being said, like it was run from Iran, that it was happy that Hamas killed Israeli civilians, that it wasn't even a Jewish group, that it was just a bunch of anti-Semites pretending to be Jews. So terrible false things. But a lot of people at the 2-hour public comment were talking against it as well, and demanding that the board stop it. The board goes into executive session. And so we're just sitting around for about an hour on an empty Zoom thing. And then they come back and they say they're going to allow it to happen. So I discovered, okay, I can travel to Montclair and I will give my talk the next afternoon. When we got there, there was like 4 squad cars, at least 15 police. There were barricades to keep people apart as people went in. It was massively well attended. There was room for 150 people in the library, and 165 showed up, and so 15 had to voluntarily leave. But there was just really nervousness. And so what I tried to do at the beginning, because you had George Lakey speak about his 8 ways to nonviolently deal with terrorist threats. And in his article about that, he goes, a scared public needs to know activists hear their fear and are on the side of safety. So I talked about in the beginning just empathizing for all the victims, not just some of the victims, not just one side or the other, but all the victims of the intense violence that had emerged and had historical roots over decades. And so things were going well. Then I started telling my story about my trip to Israel, Palestine. And about 20, 30 minutes in, a group of about 10 people out of the 150 who were all sitting together jumped up and started screaming at me, saying, this is hate speech. You're a liar. You're inciting violence against, you want to kill every Jew in the world. And there's 2 things going on here. One is there is real fear among many segments of the Jewish community about very real anti-Semitism. But also, some members of the Jewish community conflate criticism of Israeli policies in terms of violating international law and human rights, or collective punishment against Palestinians as anti-Semitic. And that's sort of what was happening. So there was both trauma and polarization, but there was also the weaponization of screaming these things at me to shut down debate, to shut down dialogue, to shut down critical thinking, to shut down curiosity and having people listen to each other and talk. And that made it so real to me, because I've never been almost canceled twice when I've talked about any topic, and I've done a lot of public speaking. And I've never been shouted down before, and that's just part of what we have to do. And so my sense is we have to listen to the trauma. We have to be aware of the polarization, but that doesn't mean we don't stand up for peace and justice. We don't get cowed by it. And we have to express real care and concern for all suffering communities, but we have to bring it always back to peace with justice. And there's tremendous work going on now. We're sort of expanding. The world is mobilizing more and more around ceasefire and working towards a real sustainable peace with justice that would allow the 22% remaining of historic Palestine to become a functioning, vibrant, democratic Palestinian state. Other people have longer term visions of a single state with equality and justice for all. I think what we need to do as faith-based activists concerned is to work against anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish bigotry, to work against Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian bigotry, the sense of political violence being okay in our country. I think we need to use our congregations and our organizations as places where dialogue and empathy can happen, and people can think through what would be a good US policy towards Israel and Palestine, because the current policy, I believe, is so bankrupt. When I was in Israel, Palestine, I was talking to so many Palestinian people, and they said, Biden's administration is the first administration in decades that didn't even pretend to have a peace initiative. They didn't even pretend to do it. They were just ignoring it. And now with, saying to the state of Israel, there are no red lines. We already give you more money, since 1948 than any other country in the world. There are no strings attached, anything you do. And now Biden has changed because of a peace movement, and he's changing his rhetoric, but not his policy. He's making nothing conditional. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I just wanted to end here, but I want my little story of dealing with polarization and backlash for standing up for peace with justice is just one among many. I wrote to my friend Syed Atshan, who is a Palestinian Quaker who teaches at Swarthmore College now. And I wrote him about my situation in Montclair, and he said something that's really important. Welcome to my world. That as he speaks as a Palestinian, he has been, for decades been, pushed around, not listened to, belittled, he's a Quaker pacifist, and he, is demonized as a terrorist all the time. He's on, websites talking about academics that, are anti-Semitic and on this. So he gets this. And I think also that the singling out that I saw of Jewish peace activists, Jewish Voice for Peace, when Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now are providing amazing moral leadership in this country and doing wonderful things. I've gone to so many of the demonstrations in DC that these two groups have organized, and they are moving, they are well organized, The messaging is empathy for everyone and a real concern for justice. And I feel that we really need to have the backs of Jewish peace groups, as well as Palestinian Americans and Muslim groups. And we need to do the hard thinking and listening. And I just think of Micah 8. What does the Lord require of us? Seek justice, practice mercy, and walk humbly with our God. And I just want to end with one bit of good news, and then we can go into dialogue about this. Is one person who stood up in the question and answer part of my talk in Montclair, New Jersey, was an Orthodox rabbi who was critical of some of the things I was saying, though he could see some common ground, and he did not support the 10 people who were shouting at me. If you watch the video of that talk, you can even hear him in the background when they're screaming at me and calling me names. He's going, "This is not the way. This is not the way." But he asked me a tough question, and I didn't have the answer to it. And so I said, here's my card, contact me. He and I have been talking since November 12th, back and forth, phone calls, emails, some Zoom things. We disagree about many things about what should be done. He actually supports Israel's response. He regrets it. He regrets the high level of civilian lives and the damage, but he feels that Hamas represents an existential threat. At the same time, he and I agree that human beings are all precious in the sight of God and that there should be peace with justice long term. We have very different ideas about how to get there and what that would look like. But we're talking with each other with respect, and we've become friends. We may even go back to Montclair. He's one town over, and I may go back, and we may do a dialogue. We're looking for a religious congregation that would support us to do a dialogue where we would model how you could actually talk and listen to each other and be curious about different viewpoints, and encourage people to think, but to support the right of free speech. And so that's just one small bit of good news out of that experience that I think is sort of a parable about what could and should be done by interfaith communities that are united for peace and justice, even when they have some big disagreements. So with that, I will finish and just thank you all and be glad to engage in a conversation.
Okay, thank you, Steve, for that presentation.
Steve Chase, thank you so much. I'm sitting here filled with gratitude and respect. We're so grateful that you live and do the work you do every day. And I'm particularly grateful this session is recorded and we will be able to share your story. My question is, you to some extent left us in the lurch. You had 10 people yelling at you. We've held sessions since October 7 and for years before that, both on the Middle East and on dialogue. So it's very important to us to learn from your experience. In the moment of the shouting, how did you handle it? How did you return to whatever prepared remarks or modify your remarks in light of the shouting? And then I gather you were able to maintain the podium and get to questions and answers. So just complete that story because it is so enlightening for many of us who have been in fraught moments. And I would say this could be the dinner table when your crazy uncle starts yelling at you, or it could be any setting in which we are attacked for expressing our deep beliefs. So take us back to the moment. How did you handle the shouting? How did you proceed? Did you embrace or acknowledge anything the shouters were saying? And then how did you complete your talk?
Great question. Thank you for that. There's a couple of different things. One is, having been an ardent Zionist myself, that took a long time to even really consider the question of Palestinian rights, and to get critical about unjust policies that the state of Israel had. I had the humility of going, I get it. I was there once too, and I was dismissive and would have been upset hearing somebody like me now talking. So part of that is a certain amount of humility. I also had a spiritual companion come with me, a friend of mine, a Quaker friend of mine from Philadelphia, because we drove up from Pendle Hill, which is a Quaker retreat and study center outside of Philadelphia. And that's where I was during this period. And so we talked over, because I knew that this was going to be fraught. I didn't know I was going to be yelled at, but I knew it was really controversial in the town. And so we just started to talk it over, and with, her help, it's like, how do I want to show up? And we had time quietly in the car, just praying. And the Montclair Friends meeting came early, several members, and they just lined the front row and they were beaming up at me while I was talking. And so I had a tremendous sense of solidarity. When the shouting happened, what I did is I first just got quiet and was trying to suss out what were the concerns that were at least being said. Some of it was so off the top because there was nothing I said that was inciting violence against Jews. There was, and so, I think most of the people there saw that it wasn't hate speech. They might disagree with me about how I thought we need to get from here to there, and address the current situation, but they didn't see that. So part of it was let it go so people could make their own judgments about, here I am calmly sharing my perspective, and what I learned on my trip, and how I think we might approach the future. So part of it was a little strategic of the extremeness, and the only person, the only persons who were screaming, you're not making me feel safe. You're not making me feel safe. They were yelling at a person who was saying that everybody needs to be safe. But I also, was able to say, I get it. I hear you. There is real disagreement, and we're going to have time in the Q&A to talk about that. But I would just like to be able to finish, from my experience and my framework, and then we can really kind of go at it in a dialogue. But I was able to keep calm in myself, because I felt like I was prepared, I was supported, I was trying to be a channel of love and compassion and loving my neighbors, including, quotes, my opponents in this moment. And we did get through a Q&A. It was fairly contentious, but it was that we moved into that. And it was important to let people let off steam and say what they wanted to say, but in a different way of trying to shut down free speech and thinking, but thinking together. So, Steve, that's how I did it. I mean, you all did a presentation with George Lakey. He's been my mentor and friend since I was 15. And so when I was up there and being shouted at, I thought, okay, what would Jesus do? But actually, what I thought was, what would George do in this? And there was a moment when one of the organizers, the JVP organizers, started shouting at the people shouting at me, which I totally understood because they were also saying terrible things about JVP that were false. And in a way, I was able to use my privilege as not in this huge debate within the Jewish community about Zionism, anti-Zionism, Jewish dissent against Israeli policy, and Jewish defensiveness around it. And I just walked up and put my arm around another Steve, who was one of the organizers, who was sort of shouting back at the people shouting at me. And I just put my arm around him and I said, let's just take a deep breath and then move on. And so I don't have any magic solution, but though, support, prayer, trying to stand up for peace with justice, even against resistance, and trying to listen with empathy, even with people who are yelling at me, but not giving in to, okay, then we just shouldn't talk anymore.
Rick Banyalis, your question, please.
Thank you. Steve, that was a great presentation. We really appreciate it. You reminded me that about something somebody said. One of the things you should never do is in a situation think, what would George Costanza do in this moment? So I'm glad you went George Lakey. That's good. I did want to talk about one of the things that I think you've gone through and other speakers on this issue that is becoming one of those trenches that we in the progressive community have a hard time getting out of. It's when we are speaking accurately, truthfully, with common sense and with compassion about a subject. And the adversarial side of that is just speaking in adversarial terms. In other words, there's no there's no common ground of accuracy, of compassion, of stating the truth. But the volume helps them keep their side of what they're saying. It has an audience, and it didn't used to be like that. It used to be that we wouldn't take the ideas of somebody who's like a LaRouche follower or a John Birch Society member that seriously, because we knew where it was coming from and we knew that they couldn't hold a discussion together. But we've seceded that high ground. And I'm wondering, is that something that we need to take a look at again, where there are some points that you might in a conversation, a one-on-one conversation, say, you know, unless you can admit at some time that I might be right, there is no need for us to have a discussion because I'm giving you that courtesy that we're going to talk and maybe you're going to have some facts that will change my perspective on this. So I'm wondering whether we can be more forceful about the nature of the conversation that we're having with that other side.
Yes. Strategically, I think that the goal is probably not to spend your major focus on trying to convince people who believe that all-out war against and collective punishment against 2.3 million people is morally legitimate, strategically sound, and just self-evident what should happen in response to an attack like Hamas's. Those people may show up when we're speaking, but there is a huge range, I think, in the American people from people who are pretty well informed what's going on and the injustice that does exist with the state of Israel oppressing the people, the Palestinian people. And then you have people who are just kind of confused and don't know and think about it as, oh, this is so complicated. This is, millennial long conflict. Therefore, there's really nothing I can do about it because I can't understand it and things like that. That sort of, that confused middle ground is where I think a lot of the attention should go. Now, when we do that, there will be people who are for all-out collective war and mass murder who try to shut that down. And so we have to deal with it. But I don't think trying to convince in one talk or even several, talks, the most extreme pro-war position. That's not the focus. It's trying to build up the forces that support peace with justice and talk to sort of the confused middle. But we have to deal with that. So strategically, I would say that it's like, figure out what is the most important audience to be speaking to, but be prepared for other people to be sitting in that audience as well.
Sorry, I have lost my screen. Okay.
Like Lindsay, Anthony, and Maggie have their hands up.
Okay, I have Lindsay, Sarah, Carol, Francis, and Anthony on the stack. So, Lindsay, do you have a question or a comment for Steve?
I do. I have a question. Steve, thank you for everything that you're doing. I watched the video of that presentation. And so there's, the people that are shouting, but then there are other people who had questions. And I'm thinking, for example, one woman fixated on a quote that you used and went on and on about having written a paper about that quote in college. In some attempt to discredit you. And it was, the dissonance was sort of like, I wasn't there in person, but I almost sounded like this woman and probably certain others like her, like just cannot reckon with what is happening, right? Like, her fixation on one quote in a presentation and her inability to say, okay, so what if you had quoted the wrong, or, taken it still doesn't change the overall nature of what we're talking about, and also what felt like an inability of some of the people commenting to at all acknowledge what was happening. I'm not even saying disagree, but I mean, just it's like they cannot acknowledge even the deaths that are happening. It's like they just can't get there. So they're fixating on these other, to me, points that don't, that don't speak to the general genocide that is happening. And I just wonder how you thought about that, how you deal with it. Because I do think she's probably not alone. And also you might disagree with me on that, but I just got the sense after she kept talking that there's something happening where she just cannot accept what Israel is doing. Like she just can't, it's like it's just not happening for her.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. I'm going to take facilitator's privilege and question one thing that you said, remembering always that we are white Westerners looking at this situation from the outside. And in the beginning, you said that Hamas has minority support in the Palestinian community. So here's an article from Reuters, which is a mainstream commercial medium. Headline: Poll shows Palestinians back October 7th attack on Israel. Support for Hamas rises. Jerusalem, December 13th. Almost 3 in 4 Palestinians believe the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel was correct, and the ensuing Gaza war has lifted support for the Islamist group both there and in the West Bank. The Palestinian Center for Policy Survey and Research findings were published as international alarm grows over the spiraling Palestinian civilian toll in the Israeli counteroffensive against Hamas, now in its 3rd month. 72% of respondents said they believed the Hamas decision to launch the cross-border operation in southern Israel was correct, given its outcome so far, while 22% said it was incorrect. The remainder were undecided and gave no answer. That to me said that's another point of view. You say that Hamas has minority support. I would say that as white Westerners, we may not have a really good sense of what the feelings of the Palestinian people collectively are. And I just want to say in closing that I think the Black and brown communities in the United States have a very different view in general from of Israel Palestine in general than we white Westerners have, the way we see the situation. And I think a critical example of that is
We've got
is
it,
the
Dave.
poll
I'm going to
is the
exercise.
poll that I just read. Okay,
Dave.
Steve, so that is my comment.
Right.
And quick comments and questions from Anthony,
first of all,
Maggie.
Dave, I just want to say, when you say we, meaning the group here, we are not all white in this group. And so I would say, let's not just think in terms of, sort of stereotypes, and realize that this group in and of itself is inclusive of great diversity racially, spiritual tradition, and some analysis, vision, and strategy going forward. So, but I do think if we could hear the questions and concerns, then I could try to address some of them. I've put my email in the chat so people can write me if questions don't get answered or if they have other things. And I've also sent to Rick some links that when the recording of this goes out, he can add those links, which has my most recent version of my talk, as well as the Montclair version of the talk, and if other people want it. But I do think we need to be careful when we say we, and then we talk about sort of a monolithic demographic when it's not even true on this Zoom call that we're all one thing.
Still have my video off. Yeah, this will be brief. I reject the notion that that being critical of the Israeli government or even being anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic, although I've heard that from a lot of people in recent months. But I have been going to rallies and protests, and there are certain phrases I hear that Jewish progressive friends of mine who are also critical of Israel are very wary of, or even afraid of these particular phrases, such as "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," or even "free Palestine," which sounds to me, as a non-Jewish person, true, neutral, not neutral, but to many Jewish people, it brings up fears of annihilation. And
Sarah, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we need to move very quickly.
Yeah,
I'd like to hear from Carol Francis
on those particular phrases or the rhetoric, and if any thoughts on that.
Thank you. Carol Francis. Carol Francis Likens.
You're muted,
Okay.
Carol.
Anthony Manousis.
Yeah, well, I just want to thank you, Steve. I do want to see that link and how you responded. I think offline, I'd like to talk to you about the support you got from your Quaker meeting. My Quaker meeting is not in unity about supporting even a ceasefire. And that's been very disappointing to me. So I have turned to a rally that we have every Monday night at Judy Chu's office with Muslims, Christians, and Jews, sponsored by Jewish Voice for Peace, the Episcopal Church, the Mennonites. And that's where I get my spiritual support. And so I think I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how you can stay faithful to the Quaker peace testimony, even if your meeting is divided. And I mean, this is an issue, even Quakers, to think would be a no-brainer that Quakers would support a ceasefire, but not so much in my meeting.
I love what you said about the Palestinian wife and the Jewish husband. And it made me realize that I really am like that Palestinian wife. Intellectually, I understand that we need to support and empathize with the Jews who lost lives or knew somebody who lost lives in October 7th. But on the other hand, I cry when I hear just tears of rage and frustration when I even think about Palestine. And I don't feel that way. And that story really meant a lot to me. By the way, I think everybody should listen to that video. It's really fascinating to see you standing there while these people are yelling at you and you're just standing there calmly.
Maggie, can we hear from you? Maggie Hutchinson?
Yes. A short question. This is what a question is. What did you think of the police response to this yelling?
Okay, and finally, on my stack, Richard Bunce.
In terms of the use of quotes, what I didn't do well there is I didn't have the citation available to me. And so that made me, I don't use a quote now unless I have the citation and I've read it enough in the original, not just the quote, but the whole context to respond. That people are going to pick apart on any little thing. And so, one of the things I learned from Montclair is I'm not using a quote unless I can really defend it. terms of polls, yes, the support for Hamas in general is going up, which is one of the reasons that the idea that mass murder and collective punishment against 2.3 million Palestinians will not deal with the threat that Hamas poses to Israeli civilians. It's just delusional. But before October 7th on the West Bank, about 7% of the population supported Hamas at that point. And gone up 3 times now. So it's at 21% that actually fully supports Hamas. And that, if you're doing this kind of mass trauma on the Palestinian people, and the Palestinian Authority, it seems ineffectual, a lot of people are going, well, there's no pathway for diplomacy. And we do need to resist one way or the other, whether it's violent or nonviolent. And there's different people who have different views about that, but at least there's some resistance. And we have to remember, even Gandhi said, it is better to resist evil violently than not to resist it at all. And then he went on to say, but in my experience, nonviolent resistance is more powerful. And there's actually some empirical justification that I could talk offline with anybody about, of some good research that suggests Gandhi may well be right. So that's on that. In terms of slogans, people have to be really strategic. What is your goal? Are you trying to trigger extra resistance to your thing, or are you trying to galvanize more and more of the American public to support de-escalation of the current conflict and a just peace? And so we do need to think about what are our slogans conveying and how to use them effectively. And that means debating, because sometimes it's not obvious what we should do. Quaker peace testimony, Anthony, happy to talk offline. And so I guess I can't read my own notes. So I think I'll close it there, but I want to talk about, as a closing, a quote that I think is really important. I went to, in Ramallah, I went to prayers, Friday prayers at a mosque. And before then, our delegation met with the imam. And he was a fascinating fellow. And he said something that is really, really poignant, and I think gives us a clue about what to do. He actually voted for Hamas in the last election cycle that happened in Palestine, which was, what was it, 2005 or 2006?
2006.
But he was against the sort of suicide bombings. He believes that there's a right to self-defense, but that sort of offensive violence directed at civilians, he didn't accept that. And he said something that I found fascinating, which is, we do not object to having Jews as neighbors. We only object to having Jews as our colonial masters. And so that's where the justice part is. Like, peace will be more possible when there's justice and equality for all between the river and the sea. And there's various ways to get there. But I just, there is this power dynamic that has to be dealt with. But it's easy, here's somebody who voted for Hamas. You might say, oh, well, he's automatically anti-Semitic. But he makes an important distinction, that he's not against Jews as Jews or as neighbors in the Holy Land. He only is opposed to Jews as colonial masters that terrorize and oppress his community.
Mhm.